Good morning, it's me, Priyanka J, and I'm back with another video. We still celebrating 28 days of Black history, Black thought, Black excellence, Black magic. We blackly black, y'all. I like this. Don't y'all love that? I got that from a local artist here in Houston that does his own works. So beautiful. If I had his name, I would tell y'all. And I was gonna come on here and tell y'all like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm going to the gym, so I look bad. But honestly, it's just how my hair grew out my head. It's how I woke up today, and it's in braids. They look like dreads, and it's a good February. I'm not even gonna tell y'all I look bad. I look black. How about that? Today I want to talk about a literary critic and someone that I look up to. Though I don't talk about him a lot, but I look up to, and his work has probably influenced my work more than I'll ever know. And it's Henry Louis Gates Jr. So if we get a chance, we're going to also read his essay, Talking Black. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Henry, Mr. Gates. He is one of the best known culture critics in America. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has played a vital role in establishing an African American literary canon and in creating a distinctive African American literary theory that combines post-structuralism with African literary tradition. A tireless man, he has also helped build institutional structure to study African American literature and has decimated his views in race and culture through mainstream media, writing for magazines such as Newsweek and The New Yorker, and frequently appearing on television. Today we're going to talk about Talking Black, critical signs of the times, and sets out his credo for present-day African American literary theory, which borrows from but revises mainstream theory with infusions of African American modes of thought and vernacular discourse. Long story short, he put on for Black people and my phone's been ringing all morning, and I'm so sorry, but if it rings again, I'm gonna chunk it out the window. I'm gonna chunk it, because you know what? Has it been a call for me? No, it's been telemarketers all morning. I don't know who sold my phone number. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So his ultimate goal is institutional as well as theoretical, and he says in himself he aims to forge a place for Black writing and criticism in the broader, larger institution of literature. So let's look at Talking Black. So it starts off with Alexander Cromwell saying, "For a language acts in diverse ways upon the spirit of a people, even as the spirit of a people acts with a creative and spiritualizing force upon a language." W.E.B. Du Bois, "A new vision began gradually to replace the political power, a powerful movement, the rise of another ideal to guide the unguided, another pillar of fire by night after a clouded day. It was the ideal of book learning, the curiosity born of compulsory ignorance, to know and test the power of the Kabbalistic letters of the white man, the longing to know. Here at last seemed to have been discovered the mountain path of Canaan, longer than the highway of emancipation and law, steep and rugged, but straight, leading to heights high enough to overlook life." And then he says, "The knowledge which would teach the white world was Greek to his own flesh and blood, and he could not articulate the message to another people." So let's look at Talking Black, okay? He says, Alexander Cromwell, a pioneering 19th century Pan-Africanist, statesman, and missionary who spent the bulk of his creative years as an Anglican minister in Liberia, was also a pioneering intellectual and philosopher of language, founding the American Negro Academy in 1897, and serving as the intellectual godfather of W.E.B. Du Bois for his first annual address as president of the Academy, delivered on December 28th of 1897. Cromwell selected his topic, "The Attitude of the American Mind Toward the Negro Intellect." We got to read that. Make sure we put that on our list for next time. It says here, given the occasion of the first annual meeting of the great intellectuals of the race, he could not have chosen a more timely or appropriate subject. Cromwell wished to attack, he said, the denial of intellectuality in the Negro, the assertion that he was not a human being, that he did not belong to the human race. He argued that the desire to cloud and stamp out the intellect of the Negro had led to the enactment of the laws and statutes, closing the pages of every book printed to the eyes of Negroes, barring the doors of every schoolroom against them. This, he concluded, was a systemized method of the intellect of the South to stamp out the brains of the Negro, a program that created an almost Egyptian darkness which fell upon the mind of the race throughout the whole land. Cromwell next shared with his audience a conversation between two Boston lawyers, which he had overheard when he was an errand boy in the anti-slavery office in New York City in 1833 or 1834. While at the Capitol, they happened to dine in the company of the great John C. Calhoun, the then senator from South Carolina. It was a period of great affirmation upon this question of slavery, states' rights, and nullification, and consequently, the Negro was the topic of conversation at the table. One of the utterances of Mr. Calhoun was to this effect, that if he could find a Negro who knew the Greek syntax, he then would believe that the Negro was a human being and should be treated as a man. Just to think of the crude obscenity, Cromwell concluded rather generously, of even a great man. The salient sign of the black person's humanity, indeed, the only sign for Calhoun, would be the mastering of the very essence of white civilization, of the very foundation of the complex fiction upon which white Western culture had been constructed. It is likely that the Greek syntax for John C. Calhoun was merely hyperbolic figure of speech, a trope of virtual impossibility. He felt driven to the hyperbolic mode perhaps because of the long racist tradition in Western letters of demanding that black people prove their full humanity. We know this tradition all too well, dotted as it is with the names of the great intellectual Western racialists such as Francis Bacon, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, and G.W.F. Hegel. Whereas each of these figures demanded that blacks write poetry to prove their humanity, Calhoun, writing in a post-Phyllis Wheatley era, took refuge in, yes, Greek syntax. In typical African-American fashion, a brilliant black intellectual accepted Calhoun's challenge. The anecdote Cromwell shared with his fellow black academians turned out to be his shaping scene of instruction, for Cromwell himself jumped on a boat, sailed to England, and matriculated at Queen's College, Cambridge, where he mastered the intricacies of Greek syntax. Calhoun, we suspect, was not impressed. Cromwell never stopped believing that mastering the master's tongue was the sole path to civilization, intellectual freedom, and social equality for the black person. It was Western culture, he insisted, that the black person must claim as his rightful heritage as a man. Not stinted training, not a caste education, not, he concluded prophetically, a Negro curriculum. As he argued so passionately in his speech in 1860, the English language in Liberia, the acquisition of the English language along with Christianity is the wonderful sign of God's providence encoded in the nightmare of African enslavement in the racist wilderness of the New World. English for Cromwell was the speech of Chaucer and Shakespeare, of Milton and Wordsworth, of Bacon and Burke, of Franklin and Webster. And its potential mastery was this one item of compensation that the Almighty had bestowed upon us. In exchange for exile of our fathers from their African homes of America, in the English language are embodied the noblest theories of liberty and the grandest ideas of humanity. It If black people master the master tongue, these great and grand ideals become African ideas, because ideas conserve men, and keep alive the vitality of nature, of nations. In dark contrast to the splendors of the English language, Crummell said the African vernacular languages, which he wrote, have definite marks of inferiority connected with them all, which place them at the wildest distances from civilized languages. Any effort to render the master's discourse in our own black tongue is an egregious error. For we cannot translate sublime utterances into broken English, a miserable caricature of their noble tongue. We must abandon forever both indigenous African vernacular languages and the Neo-African vernacular languages that our people have produced in the New World. All low, inferior, and barbarous tongues are doubtless but the leaves and dregs of noble languages which have gradually, as the soul of a nation has died out, sunk down to degradation and ruin. We must not suffer this decay on these shores in this nation. We have been made providentially the deposit of a noble trust, and we should be proud to show our appreciation of it. Having come to the heritage of this language, we must cherish its spirits as well as retain its letter. We must cultivate it among ourselves. We must strive to infuse its spirit among our reclaimed and aspiring natives. It says, I cite the examples of John C. Calhoun and Alexander Crummell as metaphors for the relation between the critic of black writing and the broader institution of literature. Learning the master's tongue for our generation of critics has been an act of empowerment. Whether that tongue be new criticism, humanism, structuralism, Marxism, post-structuralism, feminism, new historicism, or any other ism, each of these critical discourses arise from a specific set of texts within the Western tradition, at least for the past decade. Many of us have busied ourselves with the necessary task of learning about these movements in criticism, drawing upon their modes of reading to explicate the text in our own tradition. This is an exciting time for critics of African American literature. More critical essays and books are being produced than ever before, and there never have been more jobs available teaching Afro-American literature in white colleges and universities. In a few years, we shall at last have our very own Norton Anthology. A sure sign that the teaching of African American literature is being institutionalized. Our pressing question now becomes this: in what languages shall we choose to speak and write our own criticisms? What are we now to do with the enabling mask of empowerment that we have donned as we have practiced one mode of formal criticism or another? There is a long history of resistance to white theory in the black tradition. Unlike almost every other, the African American literary tradition was generated as a response to allegations that its authors did not and could not create literature. Consider the signal measure of racist innate humanity. The African living in Europe or in the New World seem to have felt compelled to create a literature, not only to demonstrate that blacks did indeed possess the intellectual ability to create a written art, but also to indict the several social and economic institutions that eliminated the humanity of all black people in Western cultures. So insistent did these racist allegations prove to be, at least from the 18th to the early 20th century, that it's fair to describe the subtext as a history of black letters in terms of the urge to refute them. Even as late as 1911, when J.E. Casely Hayford published Ethiopia Unbound, the first African novel, he felt it necessary to address this matter in the first two paragraphs of his text. At the dawn of the 20th century, the novel opens, men of light and leading both in Europe and in America had not yet made up their minds as to what place to assign to the spiritual aspirations of the black man. Few literary traditions have begun with such a complex and curious relation to criticism. allegations of an absence led directly to a presence, a literature often inextricably bound in a dialogue with its harshest critics. Black literature and its criticism, then, have been put to use that were not primarily aesthetic, rather, they have formed part of a larger discourse on the nature of the black and of his or her role in the order of things. We got a lot to go, y'all. I'm sorry. Relation among theory, tradition, and integrity within black culture has not been and perhaps cannot be a straightforward matter. Despite the fact that critics of black literature are often attacked for using theory and that some black readers respond to their work by remarking that it's all Greek to them, it is probably true that critics of Afro-American literature are more concerned with the complex relation between literature and theory than ever before. There are many reasons for this, not the least of which is our increasingly central role in their profession, precisely when our colleagues are engulfed in their own extensive debates about the intellectual merit of so much theorizing. Theory, as a second-order reflection upon a primary gesture, has always been viewed with suspicion by scholars who find it presumptuous and even decadent when criticism claims the right to stand on its own. Theoretical texts breed equally decadent theoretical responses in a creative process that can be very far removed from a poem or a novel. For the critic of African American literature, this process is even more perilous because most of the contemporary literary theory derives from critics of Western European languages and literatures. Is the use of theory to write about African American literature merely another form of intellectual indenture and mental servitude, as pernicious in its intellectual implications as any other kind of enslavement? The key word implied in this panel discussion is integrity. To quote the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of the word, does theorizing about a text of a literary tradition mar, violate, impair, or corrupt the soundness of an original perfect state of a black text or of a black tradition? To argue that it does is to align oneself with the new critics, who often seem not to have cared particularly for or about the writings of African Americans, and with their view that texts are organic wholes in the first place. This is a critical error. The sense of integrity as it seems to arise in Afro-American tradition is more akin to the notion of ringing true, or to Houston Baker's concept of sounding. That is the sense that black nationalists call on here without understanding how problematic this can be. Doubleness, alienation, equivality. Since the turn of the century at least, these have been recurrent tropes for the black tradition. To be sure, this matter of criticism and integrity has a long and rather tortured history in black letters. It was David Hume, after all, who called Francis William the Jamaican poet of Latin verse, a parrot who merely speaks a few words plainly. Phyllis Wheatley, too, has long suffered from the spurious attacks of blacks and white critics alike for being rah-rah-avists, or a school of so-called mockingbird poets, whose use of European and American literary traditions has been considered a corruption of pure black expression found in such forms such as the blues, signifying, spirituals, and Afro-American dance. Can we, as critics, escape a mockingbird relation theory? And can we escape the racism of so many critical theorists from Hume and Kant through the Southern Agrarians and Frankfurt School? Only recently have some scholars attempted to convince critics of black literature that we can. Perhaps, predictably, a number of these attempts share a concern that which has been most repressed in the received tradition of Afro-American criticism: close reading to the texts themselves. My advocacy of theories valued for such readings is meant as a prelude to definition of critical principles peculiar to the black literary traditions, related to contemporary theory generally, and yet, as Robert Ferris Thompson had put it, undoubtedly black. I have tried to work through contemporary theories of literature, not to apply them to the black text, but to transform by translating them into a new rhetorical realm, to recreate through revision the critical theory at hand. As our families, as our familiarity with the Black tradition and with literary theory expands, we shall invent in our own Black text-specific theories, as some of us have begun to do. We must learn to read a Black text with a Black formal cultural matrix, as well as its white matrix. This is necessary because the existence of the Black canon, this is historically contingent phenomenon. It is not inherent in the nature of Blackness, not vouchsafed by the metaphysics of a racial essence. The Black tradition exists only insofar as Black artists enact it. Only because Black writers have read and responded to other Black writers with a sense of recognition and acknowledgement can we speak of a Black literary inheritance with all the burdens and ironies that has entailed. Race is a text, an array of discursive practices, not an essence. It must be read with painstaking care and suspicion, not imbibed. I have tried to employ contemporary theories to defamiliarize the text of the Black tradition. Ironically, it is necessary to treat distance between reader and text in order to go beyond reflexive responses and achieving critical insight into the intimacy with their formal workings. I have done this to respect the integrity of these texts by trying to avoid confusing my experience as an Afro-American with the act of language that defines a Black text. This is the challenge of the critic of Black literature in the 1980s, not to shy away from white power, that is, literary theory, but to translate it into the Black idiom, renaming principles of criticism where appropriate, but especially naming indigenous Black principles of criticism and applying them to our own text. Any tool that enables the critic to explain the complex workings of language of a text is appropriate here. For it is language, the Black language of Black text, that expresses the distinctive quality of our literary tradition. Once it may have seemed that the only critical implements of Black critics needed were the pom-pom and the twirled baton. In fact, there is no deeper form of literary disrespect. We will not protect the integrity of our tradition by remaining afraid of or naive about literary theory. Rather, we will inflict upon it the violation of reflexive, stereotypical readings or non-reading. We are the keepers of the Black literary tradition. No matter what theories we embrace, we have more in common with each other than we do with any other critic of any other literature. We write for each other and for our own contemporary writers. This relation is a critical trust. It is also political trust. How can the demonstration that our text sustain ever closer and more sophisticated readings not be political at a time when all sorts of so-called canonical critics mediate their racism through calls for purity of their tradition, demands as implicitly racist as anything the Southern agrarian said? How can the deconstruction of the forms of racism itself not be political? How can the use of literary analysis be explicate the racist social text in which we will still find ourselves be anything but political? To be social text in which to be political, however, does not mean that I have to write at the level of Marvel comic book. My task, as I see it, is to help guarantee that Black and so-called third world literature is taught to Black and third world and white students by Black and third world and white professors, and Hereford to white mainstream departments of literature, and to train students to think, to read, and to write clearly, to expose false uses of language, fraudulent claims, and muddled arguments, propaganda, and vicious lies, from all of which our people have suffered. Just as surely as we have from an economic order in which we were zeros and a metaphysical order in which we were absences. These are the values which should be transmitted through critical theory. In the December 1986 issue of The Voice Literary Supplement, in an essay entitled "Quote Knots Meet Freaky Deek," Greek Tate argued cogently and compellingly that Black aestheticians need to develop a coherent criticism to communicate the complexities of our culture. There is no periodical on Black culture phenomena equivalent to the Village Voice or Art Forum. No publication that provides journalism on Black visual art, philosophy, politics, economics, media, literature, linguistics, psychology, sexuality, spirituality, and pop culture. Though there are certainly Black editors, journalists, and academics capable of producing such a journal, the disintegration of the Black cultural nationalist movement and the brain drain of Black intellectuals to white institutions have destroyed the voice for its public dialogue that used to exist between them. While I will argue that Sage, Kalaloo, and Black American Literature Forum are indeed fulfilling that function for academic critics, I am afraid that the truth of Tate's claim is irresistible. But his most important contribution to the future of Black criticism is to be found in his most damning allegation. What's unfortunate, he writes, is that while Black artists have opened up the entire text of Blackness for fun and games, not many Black critics have produced writing as fecund, eclectic, and freaky deek as an art, let alone the culture itself. For those who prefer exegesis with a colonial bent, just imagine how critics as fluent in Black and Western culture as the post-liberated artists could strike terror into that bastion of white supremacist thinking, the Western art, to which I can only say, echoing Suge and Alice Walker's The Color Purple, amen, amen. Tate's challenge is a serious one because neither ideology nor criticism nor Blackness can exist in entities of themselves outside of forms of their texts. There is a central theme of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, for example, but how can we write or read the text of Black theory? What languages do Black people use to represent their cultural or ideological positions? In what forms of language do we speak or write? Can we derive a valid, integral Black text or criticism or ideology from borrowed or appropriate forms? Can a Black woman's text emerge authentically as borrowed or liberated or revised from the patriarchal forms of the slave narratives, on the one hand, or from the white matriarchal forms of the sentimental novel, on the other, as Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Wilson attempted to the indictments of the life of a slave girl and Our Nig, where lies the liberation and revision, the ideological integrity of defining freedom in the modes and forms of difference charted so cogently by so many post-structural critics of Black literature. For it is in these spaces of difference that Black literature has dwelled. And while it is crucial to read these patterns of difference closely, we must understand as well that the quest was lost in a major sense before it had ever begun, simply because the terms of our own self-representation have been provided by the master. It is not enough for us to show that refutation, negation, or revision exists, and to define them as satisfactory gestures of ideological independence. Our next concern must be to address the Black political signified, that is, the cultural vision and the critical language that underpin the search through literature and art for profound reordering and humanizing of everyday existence. We must urge our writers and critics to undertake the fullest and most ironic exploration of the manner and matter, the content and form, the structure and sensibility, so familiar and poignant to us in our most sublime form of art, Black music, where ideology and art are one, whether we listen to Bessie Smith or to postmodern and post-structural John Coltrane. Just as we must urge our writers to meet this challenge, we as critics must turn to our own peculiarly Black structures of thought and feeling to develop our own languages of criticism. We must do so by drawing on the Black vernacular, the language we use to speak to each other when no outsiders are around. Unless we look to the vernacular to ground our theories and modes of reading, we will surely sink in the mire of Nella Lawson's quicksand, remain alienated in the isolation of Harriet Jacobs Garrett, or mask in the receiving stereotype of the black other helping hook, to return to the raft, singing China Gate with Nat King Kong under the Da Nang moon, or reflecting our bald heads in the shining flash of Mr. T's signifying gold chains. We must redefine theory itself from within our own black cultures, refusing to grant the racist premise that theory is something that white people do, so that we are doomed to imitate our white colleagues, like reverse black minstrel critics done up in white face. We are all heirs to critical theory, but critics are also heirs to the black vernacular critical tradition as well. We must not succumb, as did Alexander Crummell, to the tragic lure of white power, the mistake of accepting the empowering language of white critical theory as universal, as our only language, the mistake of confusing the enabling mask of theory with our own black faces. Each of us has, in some literal or figurative manner, boarded a ship and sailed to metaphorical Cambridge, seeking to master the master tool. Now we must at last don the empowering mask of blackness and talk that talk, the language of black difference. While it is true that we must, Du Bois said so long ago, know and test the power of cabalistic letters of the white man, we must also know and test the dark secrets of a black discursive universe that awaits its disclosure through the black arts of interpretation. For the future of theory and the remainder of this century is black indeed. 1988. This video is so long, so if you stuck with me and you felt me, then meet me in the next video where I go into my own personal chatter on my reflections on how I feel about what Mr. Gates had to say. But spoiler, yes, period, poo. Okay, bye.